It's fraction time. This here is a fraction. We read this fraction 3/4. 3/4, 3/4. So there's a couple of ways to read this fraction. The fraction has different parts. I'm going to label them. The fraction has a numerator. And the fraction has a denominator as well. So sometimes what we do is we think about ways to remember this. D, denominator, down. So it's the one down. It's the one furthest down. So we have 3/4, and we have the numerator over there. And then so the denominator tells you how many parts to divide a whole into. And then so we've divided this whole into fourths. So if we have this fraction bar, and this fraction bar represents 1, then again our denominator tells us how many parts we're going to divide this one whole into. We're going to divide it into fourths. Draw 1, 2, and 3 lines, where it is each of those parts is equal. So we have 1/4, 2/4, 3/4, and 4/4, where we've divided this whole into 4 equal parts. Now the other thing that we're going to do is if we take a look at the numerator, this tells us how many parts are going to be shaded. How many parts are going to be shaded? And so in this case we have 3 parts that are going to be shaded. So that's 1 part shaded, 2 parts that is shaded, and 3 parts that are shaded. So 3 out of the 4 parts are shaded. This here represents 3/4. 3/4. I've got another fraction here. We've got 2/5. It's also read 2/5. 2/5. Fifths. I've also drawn a fraction bar over here, and this fraction bar represents a whole. Now, is it divided into 2 parts, or is it divided into 5 parts? Does the numerator tell us how many parts it's divided into, or does the denominator tell us? Right, it's the denominator. And then so I'm going to go ahead and divide this into 5 equal parts. To do so, I just need to draw 4 lines. As you can see, I've drawn those 4 lines, and we now have 5 equal parts. 1, and I always check it just to make sure. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Where I've now divided this into each of these parts is worth 1/5. 1/5. And then so if I count them up, I have 1/5, 2/5, 3/5, 4/5, and 5/5, which does equal that 1 whole. Now the numerator tells us how many of those fifths I'm going to shade in. And in this case, it says to shade in 2 of them. Now if I just shaded in 1, that would represent 1/5. But if I do 1 more, then that represents 2 out of those 5 are shaded. Just to let you know, it would have been perfectly fine for 2/5 if we had shaded and we had chosen to shade 2 different fifths. We didn't have to shade the first 2. In other words, we could have shaded any of them, where it is that we got 2 out of the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 that are shaded. Still represents 2/5. What fraction would I write? What fraction would I write for this model? What would I put in the numerator? What would I put in the denominator? Right, it's divided into 2 parts, so I put the 2 there, and then one of them shaded, and you read that 1/2. You read that 1/2. Let me draw another one for you. What's the fraction that you would write for this model? What is the fraction that you would write for this model? If you said 2/3, you are correct. Let me show you another model. What's the fraction that you would write for this model? Right, 3 out of the 4 parts are shaded. and we would call this 3/4. Read those fractions with me again. 1/2, 2/3, 3/4. You try. Please draw some models for these fractions. Copy the fractions down first, and then hit pause. There are your fractions. Remember, when we're trying to divide into 7 parts, we'll only need to draw 6 lines and then count up those parts for yourself to make sure you have the correct number of parts. Hit pause. 1/3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5/7. Makes sense that there's still 2 remaining there. Gonna be right back with 3/8. To draw 3/8, I'm going to divide it in half. I'll divide each of those halves in halves, and I'll divide each of those halves in half again to go ahead and get 8s. And then how many of those are shaded? Right, 3 of them. 1, 2, and 3. If I counted them up, that's 1 8, 2 8s, 3 8s, 4 8s, 5 8s, 6 8s, 7 8s, and 8 8s. So 3 out of those 8 are shaded. That's your introduction to fractions.